In January 1984, a 14-year-old girl broke down crying in front of her teacher at a Nova Scotia school. When the teacher asked what was wrong, the girl said something that would expose one of the most horrific family abuse cases in Canadian history. She told the teacher that her father had been raping her 10 to 15 times a month, that she'd tried to tell authorities before, but no one believed her, that her entire family was involved, that this had been happening for as long as she could remember. The teacher believed her, and what Royal Canadian Mounted Police discovered when they raided the South Mountain community would reveal a clan that had been living in deliberate isolation for over a century, practicing systematic incest and abuse across 4 generations, creating children who didn't have words for rape because they had no concept of consent. The Goler Clan story begins in the 1860s when the family first settled on South Mountain in Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley. This wasn't remote wilderness thousands of miles from civilization. South Mountain was only 30 minutes from populated towns like Wolfville and Kentville. But the Golers lived as though they were completely cut off from the world. They built shacks and cabins deep in the woods on land that was essentially worthless for farming. While the prosperous communities in the Annapolis Valley below thrived on apple orchards and agriculture, the Golers existed in grinding poverty on the mountain above them. The original families who moved onto South Mountain in the late 19th century did so partly to escape poverty, and partly because they'd already been marginalized in valley communities. They were laborers, seasonal workers, people who couldn't afford valley land and couldn't compete economically with established farming families. On the mountain, they could squat on crown land or buy worthless parcels for almost nothing. They built rough cabins, hunted and trapped, survived on welfare when it became available, and gradually became known as the Mountain People, a term that carried mockery and contempt. By 1984, the clan had been isolated on South Mountain for 114 years, 4 generations living in squalor, with almost no connection to modern society, no running water, no electricity in most dwellings, no education beyond sporadic attendance at local schools. The children who did attend school were immediately identifiable, dirty, malnourished, wearing clothes that were little more than rags. They smelled. Other children avoided them. Teachers noticed but did nothing beyond the occasional wellness check that the Golers easily deflected. Valley residents had jokes about South Mountain. They called the people up there hillbillies, white trash, degenerates. There were whispered comments about inbreeding, about keeping it in the family. But these were jokes, not serious concerns that prompted action. The stereotype of the backward mountain clan served a social function. It allowed valley residents to draw a clear line between themselves and the Golers, to feel superior, to justify not helping. If the Golers were fundamentally different, fundamentally other, then their poverty and dysfunction weren't problems that required community intervention. They were just how those people were. Daily life on South Mountain was a battle for survival. The Goler children scavenged in town dumps for clothes, furniture, anything useful. They snared rabbits and caught fish in mountain streams. Some begged or stole food from valley stores. Winters were brutal. Cabins had inadequate heating. Children wore insufficient clothing. Hunger was constant. The contrast between the prosperous Annapolis Valley below and the decaying cabins on the ridge above was stark. You could see the valley orchards from South Mountain. You could look down at the tidy farms and comfortable houses. The geographic distance was negligible. The social distance was infinite. The family was led by patriarch William Dennis Goler and matriarch Stella Goler in the 1980s. They lived with 5 of their sons and several grandchildren in a deteriorating structure that barely qualified as shelter. Around them on South Mountain were other Goler households, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, all living in similar conditions, all maintaining the family's code of silence. The Golers didn't trust outsiders. They didn't want help from social services. The children were victims, but as they grew older, many became perpetrators themselves, continuing the cycle with younger children. This wasn't hidden abuse happening in secret. This was normalized behavior that occurred openly within the clan, behavior that had been passed down through generations as though it were acceptable. The abuse wasn't just perpetuated through example, it was actively taught. Older children were sometimes ordered by adults to teach younger siblings or cousins what had been done to them. This served multiple purposes. It spread the abuse throughout the clan, it implicated victims as perpetrators, and bound them to silence through guilt, and it reinforced clan loyalty. If everyone was complicit, no one could report without incriminating themselves. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating and self-protecting. Threats were used to enforce silence. Children who showed signs of talking to outsiders were told that authorities would take you away forever, that the family would be split up, and everyone would starve. Given that the Golers had almost no contact with normal society, children had no framework for understanding that removal might actually mean rescue. They'd been taught to fear the outside world, to view social workers and police as enemies who wanted to destroy their family. That was the first time she could remember, but it wouldn't be the last. The abuse continued throughout her childhood, happening so frequently that it became a routine part of life. Donna had no framework to understand that what was happening to her was wrong. In the Goler Clan, this was just what fathers did to daughters. The children tried to tell people. Starting around 1980, several Goler children attempted to disclose the abuse to teachers, social workers, and other authorities. A child would hint to a school nurse during a routine checkup. Another would tell a teacher they didn't want to go home. One tried to explain to a visiting social worker why they had bruises, but they weren't believed. The stories seemed too extreme, too shocking. Surely this couldn't be happening in Canada in the 1980s, in a community just 30 minutes from normal towns. Part of the problem was that the children themselves didn't have language for what was happening. They'd use vague terms, euphemisms, or wouldn't be able to articulate clearly because of developmental delays and limited vocabulary. When a 5-year-old tried to explain sexual abuse but couldn't use anatomically correct terms, adults often dismissed it as confusion or imagination. When older children were more explicit, adults sometimes assumed they were lying for attention or making excuses for behavioral problems. There were also systemic barriers to intervention. Kings County social services were chronically underfunded and understaffed. Rural poverty was widespread in Nova Scotia, and the Golers were just one struggling family among many. Social workers were overwhelmed with caseloads. When they did visit South Mountain, the Golers presented a united front. Adults denied any problems, kept abused children out of sight, and skillfully deflected concerns. Without clear evidence and with limited resources, social workers moved on to more cooperative cases. There was also bias at work. The Golers were poor, uneducated, marginalized. They represented a problem that the broader community didn't want to acknowledge or address. It was easier to assume that poverty and dysfunction were just how those people lived, rather than to dig deeper and uncover the horror underneath. The stereotype of the ignorant hillbilly actually protected the clan from scrutiny. If you expect a family to be dysfunctional, you're less likely to investigate when you see signs of dysfunction. The Goler children lived in conditions that child welfare workers would later compare to third world poverty. Cabins with dirt floors, holes in the walls, no heat in winter, children sleeping on bare mattresses covered in urine stains, no food beyond occasional scraps. Malnutrition was universal. Several children had severe developmental delays caused by both genetic damage from inbreeding and profound neglect. They couldn't speak properly. Many were functionally illiterate, despite sporadic school attendance. Their intellectual development had been stunted by an environment that offered no stimulation, no safety, and no care. The abuse wasn't just sexual, it was physical and psychological as well. This wasn't denial. This was a worldview so warped by generations of abuse that they genuinely didn't understand why outsiders viewed their behavior as criminal. The clan's isolation was both geographic and cultural. The Golers had lived on South Mountain for over a century, and during that time they'd developed their own insular culture. They didn't trust people from the valley below. They viewed themselves as separate, as different. The townspeople looked down on them, called them hillbillies, made jokes about inbreeding. The Golers internalized that stigma and used it as justification for remaining isolated. If the outside world was going to judge them anyway, why bother engaging with it? Better to stay on the mountain, where they could live by their own rules. But isolation breeds ignorance, and ignorance enables abuse. And the Goler children had no exposure to normal family dynamics. They didn't know that other families weren't structured around sexual exploitation. They had no word for rape because they'd never been taught that rape was different from other sexual activity. In January 1984, 14-year-old Sandra Goler, another pseudonym assigned by courts, finally found someone who believed her. She broke down in front of a teacher at her school and told the truth about what was happening on South Mountain. The teacher contacted authorities immediately. This time, instead of dismissing the claim as exaggeration or adolescent drama, police took it seriously. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched an investigation into the Goler Clan, and what they uncovered would shock even experienced investigators who dealt with child abuse cases before. In August 1984, the RCMP raided multiple Goler properties on South Mountain simultaneously. Officers entered cabins and shacks across the clan's territory, removing children and arresting adults. What they found confirmed Sandra's testimony and went far beyond it. 16 children were removed from Goler households that day. Detectives tried to map out family relationships, but kept encountering loops where individuals were both parent and sibling to the same child, or uncle and grandfather simultaneously. The family tree didn't branch. It tangled and folded back on itself. Investigators used pseudonyms to protect child victims' identities, but even keeping track of who was who became difficult when relationships were this convoluted. Interviewing the child victims required specialized techniques. Many had severe developmental delays and limited vocabulary. Some couldn't answer direct questions and needed to use drawings to communicate what had happened. Investigators had to be careful not to ask leading questions that might contaminate testimony, but also had to work with children who'd never been taught that what happened to them had names. Multiple interview sessions were required for each child, often spread over weeks or months, as trust was built. During interrogation, the arrested Golers did something that stunned investigators. The charges included rape, sexual assault, incest, and child prostitution. Among those charged were William Dennis Goler, the patriarch, his nephew William James Goler, and multiple other family members spanning 2 generations. Given the detailed confessions, prosecutors expected guilty pleas and quick sentencing, but that's not what happened. The Golers recanted their confessions, all of them. They claimed police had coerced the statements, that they'd been confused during interrogation, that the confessions weren't accurate. They pleaded not guilty and demanded trials. This created an enormous burden for the Kings County legal system, which had only one full-time prosecutor who normally handled 1 or 2 rape cases per year. Now that prosecutor faced over a dozen defendants on more than 130 charges, all pleading not guilty despite having confessed on tape. The trials became a media sensation. National news outlets covered the Goler Clan extensively, calling them a hillbilly sex ring, and comparing the case to the movie Deliverance. Television crews descended on the Annapolis Valley. Reporters interviewed Valley residents who expressed shock, but also admitted they'd always known something wasn't right up on South Mountain. The sensational coverage brought attention to the case, but also reinforced harmful stereotypes about rural poverty and Appalachian-style culture. The media narrative fixated on inbreeding, poverty, and backwoods stereotypes, while largely ignoring the broader question of how this had been allowed to continue for over a century. The Golers weren't monsters from another planet. They were a family that had been failed by every system meant to protect children, failed by schools where teachers noticed but didn't act, by social services that were underfunded and overwhelmed, by neighbors who'd turned a blind eye for generations, because intervening would have required acknowledging the Golers as part of their community. The courtroom was packed for the trials. Public gallery seats filled immediately. Media representatives jostled for space. The tension was palpable when child witnesses entered to testify. Judges took unusual steps to make the environment less intimidating, addressing children directly, explaining procedures in simple language, allowing breaks when witnesses became overwhelmed. But nothing could make testifying easy for children who were being forced to describe in detail how family members had raped them. The key witness at trial was Donna Goler, who was 11 years old when she was removed from the clan. By the time the trials began, Donna was old enough to testify. She paused frequently, broke down crying, needed multiple breaks, but she continued. She described specific incidents, named perpetrators, explained how the abuse had been normalized within the family. Her testimony shifted public perception. The media narrative that had initially treated this as a grotesque curiosity, bizarre hillbillies doing shocking things, began to change. People started seeing the human tragedy. These weren't monsters. They were children who'd been tortured by the adults meant to protect them. Her courage in testifying helped convict not just her father, but multiple other family members who'd participated in the abuse. The jury heard her describe how her father would come into her room, how he'd threaten her if she resisted, how he'd told her this was normal and that outside authorities couldn't be trusted. They heard how she'd tried to tell teachers and hadn't been believed. By the time Donna finished testifying, there was no question that the abuse had occurred and that it had been systematic. 13 of the 16 defendants were convicted and received jail sentences ranging from 1 to 7 years. William Dennis Goler, the patriarch, received the longest sentence at 7 years. His nephew, William James Goler, received 4.5 years. Juanita Goler received 4 years. The others received sentences between 1 and 3 years, shockingly short given the scale and severity of the abuse. The light sentences reflected both the limitations of Canadian sentencing guidelines at the time and the fact that judges struggled to comprehend how to punish a crime this systematic and generational. The impact on the Annapolis Valley community was immediate and measurable. 1 year after the arrests, the region's Family and Children's Services Organization experienced a 108% increase in reported child abuse cases. The Goler case had broken through a wall of silence. Other victims in other families suddenly felt able to come forward. Teachers and social workers who'd previously dismissed concerns as overreaction now took allegations seriously. The Goler trials forced an entire region to confront how easily children could be abused in plain sight when adults chose not to look closely. The children removed from the Goler clan faced enormous challenges integrating into normal society. Many were placed in foster care, but adjusting to normal life proved almost impossible for some. They'd never used a toilet, never slept in a real bed, never eaten at a table with utensils. Basic social norms were completely foreign. Some children couldn't be placed in traditional foster homes and required specialized residential care facilities equipped to handle their severe needs. Educational intervention revealed that some children had more cognitive capacity than initially thought. With proper nutrition, medical care, and education, several began to develop skills that had been suppressed by malnutrition and abuse. But others were so profoundly damaged, both genetically and psychologically, that they would require supervised care for the rest of their lives. The inbreeding had caused irreversible neurological damage in multiple children. The abuse had created psychological trauma that no amount of therapy could fully heal. Donna Goler's life after removal was difficult. She cycled through multiple foster placements. Some were good, others were not. She struggled with the transition from the isolated mountain clan to modern society. Basic tasks that other teenagers took for granted, using a phone, shopping in a store, navigating social relationships, were foreign to her. She had nightmares. She battled depression. But she also began to understand that what had happened to her was not normal, not acceptable, and not her fault. In 1998, 14 years after her rescue, Donna made a decision that would define the next phase of her life. She became an activist, campaigning to change Canadian law to better protect children from convicted pedophiles. She was motivated in part by devastating news. Her father had been released from prison after serving his sentence and had reoffended, sexually assaulting another child. He was back in court facing charges again while Donna was fighting to change the laws that had failed to protect his new victim. Donna's proposed changes to the criminal code included making it illegal for convicted child sex offenders to be alone with anyone under 14 without supervision. She argued that anyone convicted of sexually abusing a child should be permanently barred from babysitting nieces, nephews, cousins, or even their own children without another adult present. The law as it existed allowed convicted pedophiles to have unsupervised contact with children once they'd served their sentences. Donna believed this was insane. She wrote hundreds of letters to members of Parliament. She gave media interviews. She testified at parliamentary hearings. Nova Scotia Conservative MP Peter Mackay took up her cause and introduced a private member's bill incorporating her proposed reforms. Donna said publicly that if this attempt failed, she would try again. And she did. Her advocacy work continued for years, bringing national attention to gaps in Canadian child protection law. The outcomes for Goler Clan survivors varied dramatically. Some, like Donna, managed to build relatively functional adult lives despite their traumatic childhoods. They learned to read and write, held jobs, formed families with strict protective boundaries around their own children. They broke the cycle, but they carried the burden of their past every day. Relationships were difficult because their concept of family had been so warped. Trust was hard because every adult in their early lives had betrayed them. Others struggled profoundly. Some cycled through institutions, group homes, psychiatric facilities, correctional facilities. Substance abuse was common as survivors tried to self-medicate trauma that therapy couldn't fully address. Several ended up homeless at various points. A few died young from overdoses or suicide. The genetic damage from generations of inbreeding left some with cognitive disabilities so severe that independent living was never possible. They required supervised care for life, their potential destroyed before they were born by the adults who created them. Trauma-informed therapy, when available, helped some survivors begin to process what had happened. Support groups connecting Goler survivors with each other provided community and validation. But resources were limited, especially in rural Nova Scotia. Many survivors were left to cope on their own, carrying secrets and scars that most people couldn't comprehend. Some chose to maintain contact with each other. Others completely cut ties with anyone connected to South Mountain, trying to build new identities separate from the clan. In 1998, journalists David Cruz and Allison Griffiths published On South Mountain, The Dark Secrets of the Goler Clan, a book examining the case in detail. The book drew on court records, interviews with survivors including Donna Goler, and historical research into the family's century-long presence on South Mountain. It provided context for how a family could become so isolated and dysfunctional, exploring themes of poverty, social prejudice, and the failure of institutions meant to protect vulnerable children. The Goler case is often compared to other incest clan cases like the Colt family in Australia and the Whitaker family in West Virginia. What these cases share is geographic isolation, extreme poverty, multi-generational inbreeding, and systematic sexual abuse normalized within the family structure. But the Goler case is distinct in one significant way: proximity to normal society. The Golers weren't hidden in remote wilderness. They were 30 minutes from towns with schools, hospitals, and social services. Their abuse happened in view of a community that chose not to see it. This pattern of isolation plus poverty plus stigma, creating perfect conditions for multi-generational abuse, appears across different countries and contexts. Whether it's South Mountain in Nova Scotia, the Australian bush, or isolated valleys in Appalachia, the dynamics are similar. Families cut off from mainstream society, economically marginalized, socially stigmatized, left alone for generations, and in that isolation, with no external oversight or intervention, abuse becomes normalized and self-perpetuating. What makes the Goler case particularly damning for Canadian society is that the isolation wasn't unavoidable. South Mountain wasn't the Arctic. It was 30 minutes from Wolfville, a university town with resources and educated professionals. The Goler children attended schools where trained teachers saw them regularly. Social services existed. The infrastructure for intervention was in place. But social distance, stigma, prejudice, the desire not to deal with those people, created separation just as effective as geographic isolation. The teachers who saw the Goler children come to school dirty and malnourished year after year bear some responsibility. The social workers who responded to concerns but didn't investigate thoroughly enough bear responsibility. The neighbors who made jokes about those people on the mountain instead of reporting suspected abuse bear responsibility. The valley communities that benefited from seasonal Goler labor but refused to acknowledge them as part of the social fabric bear responsibility. The Goler adults who committed the abuse bear primary responsibility, but they operated within a system that enabled their behavior through decades of deliberate neglect. Today, South Mountain remains home to some descendants of the Goler clan, though the family no longer exists as an organized entity. The children removed in 1984 are now in their 40s and 50s. Some have children of their own, and breaking the cycle of abuse has been their greatest accomplishment. All of them carry the knowledge that their childhoods were stolen by adults who should have protected them but instead exploited them. The Goler case exposed fundamental failures in how society protects children in isolated communities. When families live off the grid, when children are homeschooled or attend school sporadically, when poverty makes them invisible to middle-class social workers, abuse can flourish for generations. The systems meant to catch these cases, mandatory reporting, child welfare agencies, school oversight, only work when someone is paying attention. And for 114 years, no one paid sufficient attention to the Golers. The light sentences received by the convicted Golers sparked outrage among victim advocates and the general public. 7 years maximum for decades of systematic child rape seemed grossly inadequate. But judges at the time were constrained by sentencing guidelines that didn't account for this type of generational, clan-wide abuse. The legal system was designed to punish individual offenders for individual crimes, not to address systemic abuse involving dozens of perpetrators and victims across multiple generations. The Goler case revealed that the law wasn't equipped to deal with family-wide criminal enterprises built around child exploitation. The psychological damage to Goler children was profound and lasting. Many developed severe PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Some struggled with substance abuse as adults, self-medicating to cope with the childhood trauma. Others had difficulty forming healthy relationships because their understanding of family and intimacy had been so warped by abuse. The cost of the Goler Clan's crimes didn't end with the convictions. It continues in the lives of survivors who will spend decades processing trauma that should never have happened. If there's a lesson in the Goler Clan story, it's that proximity doesn't equal protection. The Golers lived 30 minutes from modern society, but they might as well have been on another planet for all the good that proximity did their children. Distance isn't just geographic. It's social, economic, and cultural. And when societies create distance between themselves and marginalized groups, calling them hillbillies, treating them as other, turning away from their suffering, abuse becomes inevitable. The Goler children were failed not just by their family, but by everyone who could have intervened but chose not to. Teachers who saw but didn't act. Social workers who checked boxes but didn't dig deeper. Neighbors who joked but didn't report. A community that drew clear lines between respectable valley people and mountain trash, and used those lines to justify abandoning children to their fate. The abuse was committed by the Golers, but it was enabled by a society that decided some children weren't worth protecting. The Goler Clan case remains one of Canada's most disturbing examples of family-wide systematic abuse. Over a century of isolation, 4 generations of inbreeding, 137 criminal charges, 16 children rescued, and countless others who suffered before 1984 without any rescue at all. It's a story about how evil isn't always dramatic or foreign. Sometimes it's mundane, generational, and happening just 30 minutes from your town while you look the other way.